Welcome again to our speaker tonight, David Feiler, known to many, if not all of you. David was born in 1948 in London. He studied mathematics at Manchester University and Imperial College London, and also learned for a year at Yeshivat Keren B'Yavne. In 1971, he made Aliyah and worked as a researcher at Tel Aviv University. In 1980, David assumed a position in Atlanta, Georgia, working as a software developer. 12 years later, he moved to Syracuse, New York, to take up a planning position with a major energy company. There, he was active in the Young Israel Synagogue as treasurer, gabbai, and occasional provider of shiurim during the rabbi's absence. At the end of 2012, he retired and made Aliyah again, settling in Netanya. David is married to Tziona, and they have 2 married sons and 4 grandchildren, equally split between Israel and USA. David's subject tonight is a survey of Jewish folklore. Sit back and enjoy. David.
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Tzipi. So yes, first I would like to indeed thank Tzipi and Elizabeth for inviting me to speak here again. I think this is the 3rd time that I've spoken to the Core Library series of winter lectures. Just a general comment, I think it's really a fine gesture that you provide an opportunity to local residents to contribute of their knowledge as best as they can to our overall community, even though we are often speaking about topics which are not necessarily connected with our previous professional lives. For this presentation, my primary reference source is a book called The Hebrew Folktale by Eli Yassif, who was the professor of Hebrew literature and Jewish folklore at Tel Aviv University. And of course, the book that I'm using, I found with Tzipi's assistance in the Core Library. The book won the National Jewish Book Award soon after its publication and, I guess, translation in 1999. Now, the literature of Jewish folklore extends over a period of some 2,000 years, virtually the length of Jewish literacy. And what we're going to do is briefly survey the period starting with the Talmudic and Midrashic times through the Middle Ages up to some 18th century Hasidic works. Before I start, I just want to add a word about my personal interest in this topic. When I was about 13 or 14 years old, we had on the family bookshelf 2 books written by Nathan Orzabel, A Treasury of Jewish Humor and A Treasury of Jewish Folklore. They, together with his other book, A Pictorial History of the Jewish People, were popular books in the 1960s, often given as bar mitzvah gifts or as prizes to children in Cheder. That's how I think we got ours. I used to spend many pleasurable hours thumbing through the folklore book randomly. It's a sort of book you can just open at any page and just flip through it. And I sort of became somewhat hooked on the genre. I don't claim to have any professional training in this area of literature, nor any other literature for that matter. But it seems to me that this is a field which can be studied and appreciated and discussed intelligently on many different levels. In preparing for this talk, some of the other material that I found online was far too academic and esoteric for me, and probably also for most of this audience. The researchers there delve into comparisons with world mythology, anthropology studies related to the oral and written transmission of folk stories through the generations, and so on. In particular for us, these academics, in many cases, approach Bible studies from an extremely secular basis. And this is predominantly noticeable when they discuss stories from the Apocrypha, the so-called Sfarim HaChitzoniyim, external books. Books such as Tobit and Enoch, with their stories of Nephilim, of giants, and love between a demon and a woman. The various books of the Apocrypha, although possibly written by Jews, were never accepted as part of the canon of the Jewish Bible, the Tanakh. But they have become somewhat acceptable to the Catholic and Protestant churches. But one partial exception, I think, is the Book of Maccabees. There's 2 books, 1 and 2, which, although considered part of the Apocrypha, do contain much detail about the Hanukkah story, including the martyrdom of Hannah and her 7 sons. In fact, you might have seen in the paper yesterday Israel just announced they discovered a treasure trove of Maccabean era coins in the Judean desert, and they've drawn some corroboration between those coins and text in the book of Maccabees. Unlike Purim, which has its own tractate in the Gemara, Hanukkah receives scant Talmudic attention, and therefore the book of Maccabees provides historical details that otherwise would be unknown to us. Nevertheless, in our presentation, we will not deal with this genre. Instead, we will start with the Midrashic literature, including material from Talmudic sources, Talmudic Agadata. One of the reasons for the successful preservation of Jewish folklore, more than that of other historical cultures, is that much of this literature, possibly with the exception of the wisdom of Helm, finds its roots firmly entrenched in the Torah and in Nach. Since the Tanakh text itself has been so scrupulously guarded for such a lengthy period of time, despite the dispersion into various exile locations, it follows that allied literature such as folklore has been equally well preserved for posterity. Now, anyone who has studied a little Talmud will be aware that, broadly speaking, Talmud contains two fundamental types of material, halakha and agadata. Halakha, based on the Mishnah, describes the legalistic, complex discussions between the Amoraim of the Gemara, whereas agadata refers to the descriptive stories, often which are interspersed between sections of halakha, which are pertinent to those sections. In yeshivot, today and in times gone by, the tendency is to concentrate heavily on learning the intricacies of halakha, while skimming across, but not omitting, much of the Agadata sections. However, in some ways, for the novice at least, Agadata is linguistically harder to learn. It's more challenging without study aids because it's always written in Aramaic, not Hebrew. And since it brings stories from everyday life, it can employ a wide-ranging and unfamiliar vocabulary range. Conversely, halakha, although also written primarily in Aramaic, utilizes a much more restrictive and often repetitive choice of words, and in English, for example, such as innocent and guilty, lender and borrower, various standard agricultural terms, civil law terminology, personal status terminology, etc., very limited vocabulary. In the 16th century, much of the Talmudic Agadata was extracted by Yaakov ibn Habib into a separate book known as the Ein Yaakov, which is often studied by small groups of men, mainly, who prefer the ease of studying the storytelling content to the linguistic complexity in the Talmud. In Congregation Young Israel here, the late David Nemtsov, whom many of you will remember, used to lead a group, an informal group, studying the Ein Yaakov every week. Even though Ein Yaakov is pure Agadata, there are some 20 commentaries written about it to provide extensions from the simple meaning of the text and to relate it to the text of the Gemara. And also there exist modern English translations to overcome some of the obscurity of the original Aramaic. The various Midrashic literature is similar to the Agadata from the Talmud and was compiled and aggregated in the same time period. The rabbis of that period were not all pedants or full-time closeted scholars. They had occupations, and they were out in the workplace from where they could draw on everyday circumstances as inspirations for their stories. Some Midrash books are considered primarily halachic in nature, such as the Mechilta, the Sifra, and the Sifri, but others are more story-oriented. The Midrash Rabbah, all the various books of Midrash Rabbah tend to be story-oriented. Now just think back, all of you, perhaps, to your early Cheder education, where you would have learned about Avram surviving Nimrod's furnace, or Moshe touching the hot coal instead of Pharaoh's crown, and then burning his tongue. The Torah simply tells us that Moshe had a speech impediment, but it's the Midrash that complements the Torah text by providing a possible root cause for that impediment. How about another childhood favorite? God was looking for a suitable leader to take the Bnei Israel out of Egypt. Moshe was a shepherd who happened to notice a lamb was missing from his flock. He searched for the lamb and found it drinking desperately from a stream. Moshe waited patiently until the lamb had finished and then carried it back delicately to its mother. At this sight, God said, "Now I have found a man fit to shepherd the whole of Israel." These midrashic stories complement the Torah text, and indeed Rashi quotes extensively from midrashic sources in his commentary on the Chumash. Let's take a look at some less well-known midrashim that expand on Torah narratives. The historical sources of these stories are not really known in detail. They came into being during the time when the Gemara was being compiled and completed as a written corpus of knowledge. That is, in the 200 to 500 Common Era period, which of course is well after the destruction of the Second Temple. That means that in this period, the focal points of Judaism had shifted away from the temple sacrifice to two other rabbinic locales, the Bet Knesset and the Bet Midrash. Just as today, the Bet Knesset was primarily dedicated to prayer, and the Bet Midrash was a center of learning. No doubt there's some overlap between them, just as today we also conduct shiurim in our Bet Knesset. However, from a folklore perspective, there existed a third but less significant focal point, and that would have been the marketplace, where scholars conjecture that informal conversations certainly could have morphed into stories that eventually migrated to the Bet Midrash. At any one time, often on Shabbat or holidays, the learning emphasis in the Bet Midrash would have typically revolved around the discussion and interpretation of just a few Torah verses, not the whole grand spectrum of knowledge. Not much has changed. Today, when you hear a shiur in shul on Chumash, more often than not, it starts and ends with one or two specific verses, possibly bringing in additional verses from elsewhere in a supporting role. That in turn would provide a trigger for the rabbis to broaden the discussion and generate additional ideas on a very specific topic. Those ideas, especially when taught to the general population, would have been repeated further, perhaps subsequently in the marketplace or the Bet Knesset, and eventually would have been recorded in the name of Rabbi so-and-so as Midrash or Talmudic Agadata. That is what we generally define as folklore, stories with a finite generation point that are then retold over and over the years, accumulating modifications until eventually being written down and preserved for future generations. In general, a common characteristic of midrashic literature is a self-contained story of high drama, which does not necessarily rely on the precise text of the Torah verses. Examples of this would be midrashim about Cain and Abel, the flood, the binding of Isaac, Joseph and his brothers, Moshe, King David, King Solomon, and especially Eliyahu Hanavi. All of these personae in the Bible experienced high drama events in their lifetimes, which in turn spawned miraculous stories about them. Let's look at a couple of examples. Let's take the midrashic stories around the rivalry between Cain and Abel. We all know the Torah text, which explains the rivalry being based on whose offering would be accepted by God. But now consider this taken from the Midrash Bereshit Rabbah. Cain was born with a twin sister. Abel was born with two twin sisters, or triplets. They each married the sister born with them, and although later that was forbidden, God permitted this union of siblings so that the world would become populated. That left one single sister. Shortly after the episode of the offerings, Cain met Abel in the field, and they began quarreling. Our sages provide four possible reasons for their argument. 1, they argued about who would marry the remaining sister. That's understandable. 2, at this point, Cain and Abel were Adam's only sons, and since Adam had separated from Eve after their sin in Gan Eden as a form of repentance, they did eventually get back together again and had other children. But at this point, Cain and Abel thought they would eventually inherit and divide the whole world between the two of them. They quarreled over who would inherit the spot where the temple would be built. 3, Cain and Abel divided the world between them, Cain took all the land, Abel took all the movable property. They met up in the field. Cain said to Abel, "What are you doing walking on my land? You have no permission. Fly away from here." Abel responded, "What are you doing wearing my clothes? You have no permission. Take them off immediately." And the fourth possible reason for the argumentation was that Cain and Abel argued about the existence of the world to come and concepts of reward and punishment. As to how Cain killed Abel, there were three opinions brought by the Midrash. Cain actually did not know how to kill Abel because he didn't know the place of the vital organs. So he began to beat him and over his whole body until eventually Abel died. The second possibility is Cain remembered how his father had sacrificed an animal to God by slitting its throat. So he did the same to Abel. And the third option Midrash brings is he bit him like a snake. So what the Midrash is doing here is expounding on the 4 or 5 verses in the Torah about Cain and Abel. It is a self-contained narrative which assumes that the reader is familiar with the underlying Torah text, but avoids the necessity to explicitly use any of those verses. Let's take a look at another tumultuous event in world history, early world history, the drunkenness of Noah. You all know the story from the Torah. Torah tells us that after the flood, the first thing that Noah does is to plant a vineyard, not a wheat field, not an orchard, but a vineyard. He proceeds to drink the wine, gets drunk and naked, and is abused as a result. But now let's look at the account that's related in Midrash Tanchuma. While Noah was planting the vineyard, Satan appears and casually asked him, "What are you planting?" When Noah answered, "A vineyard," Satan asked, "What's that?" Noah explained that it produces fruit that can be made into wine, which causes the heart of man to rejoice. So Satan knew a big opportunity when he saw one, and he volunteered to irrigate the vineyard. However, instead of using water, he proceeded to slaughter a lamb, a lion, a pig, and an ape. The Midrash now spells out exactly what these 4 animals signify. Before drinking wine, man is as innocent as a lamb. After he drinks a moderate amount of wine, he believes himself to be as strong as a lion. When he drinks more than he should, he behaves like a pig. And after he becomes completely intoxicated, he behaves like a monkey, completely unaware of what he's doing. The Midrash concludes that if this is what happened to the righteous Noah, imagine the effect that alcohol can have on the rest of us. So we see from here, from this Midrash, a warning against excessive drunkenness. Perhaps the most famous of all Midrashim that all young children love comes later with Avram smashing all the idols in the shop of Terach, his father, and then blaming it on a fight between the idols. Clearly bringing home to his family and his social circle Avraham's early perspective about monotheism. But then what happened? The Midrash tells us that Terach took Avraham and gave him over to King Nimrod to adjudicate his fate. Nimrod instructs Avram, "Let us worship the fire." Avram said to him, "Should we then not worship water, which extinguishes fire?" Nimrod said to him, "Okay, then let us worship water." Avram says to him, "Should we then not worship the clouds which carry the water?" Nimrod said, "Okay, let's worship the clouds." Avram then said to him, "If so, should we then not worship the wind, which brings and scatters the clouds?" Nimrod said, "Okay, then let's worship the wind." Avram said to him, "Should we then not worship the human being who withstands the wind?" Nimrod said to him, "All right, enough." He said, "You're merely playing with words. As I said initially, we should bow to none other than the fire. I shall therefore cast you in the fire, and let your God, to whom you bow, come and save you from it." Notice there's echoes here in a way of Chad Gadya, the way these things all progress. Now, of course, Abraham was saved from the fire, but his brother Haran was not so fortunate. So this story fills in details of Avram's life before Lech Lecha, where the Torah is very sparse. Other than quoting the names of the heroes and villains, it has no supporting basis in the Torah, so it can stand independently. There are some literary motifs of this story that find common ground in world folklore. The use of the oral narrative, the dialogues, the use of folk idioms such as Terach implying to his son, "Why are you making a fool of me?" When Terach responds, "How can the idols kill each other?" Avram responds, "Should not your ears listen to what your mouth is saying?" The young son makes good. The young son is brought before the local ruler, where his greatness and innocence is revealed to all. The reductio ad absurdum brought by Avram before Terach, that the idols killed each other. Being saved from the fire is also found in non-Jewish folklore, in particular in early Christian stories about saints being convicted, but then saved from the fire or from the lion's den. Let's move some years ahead to Shlomo Melech, King Solomon. He, together with Eliyahu Navi, are two of the most popular folk heroes of the Tanakh. Of course, the Tanakh does extol Shlomo's wisdom, his wealth, and his love of women, all of which provide extensive source material for creative folklore, just as today in certain circles, lahavdil, Hollywood stars are extensively observed and lauded. There exists wide-ranging Midrashic literature about King Solomon and his amazing feats. Let's cover two of them. Firstly, Malkat Shva, right, the Queen of Sheba. The Midrashic account is as follows, although there are other versions told by Coptic sources, Christian sources, and others. In fact, this Midrash has spawned much artwork as well as many other legends that variously portray the Queen of Sheba as a wealthy and wise monarch, or as a black Ethiopian queen, or even as a half-demon with hairy legs. We are told that the Queen of Sheba heard of Solomon's great wisdom and resolved to meet and test him. The Tanakh just tells us in 12 verses that she came in a great caravan, carrying riches, perfumes, and etc. to Jerusalem with the intention of asking King Solomon, a number of riddles, but does not specify any details. The Midrash steps in with various cases of these riddles. All the riddles revolve around issues of gender. The first riddle deals with the female birth cycle, menstruation, pregnancy, birth, and nursing. The riddle is made especially elusive by using masculine plural verb forms, even though the subject matter is clearly feminine. King Solomon, invoking the following verse from the book of Proverbs, "For the Lord grants wisdom, knowledge and discernment are his by his decree," King Solomon answers all parts of the first riddle. The second riddle was as follows. She asks him, "How can a woman say to her son, 'Your father is my father. Your grandfather is my husband. You are my son, and I am your sister?'" Solomon replied, very easy, "The two daughters of Lot, who became pregnant by their father and each bore sons." You might want to think about that one after we finish tonight. The third riddle, more of a challenge than a riddle, she brought before him a number of very similar looking children wearing identical clothes. And she asked him from afar to distinguish between the boys and the girls. This he did as follows. What did he do? He offered all of them sweet nuts and corn, enticing food. The boys, not being bashful by nature, took all the food and stuffed it inside their inner clothing. The girls, being more bashful, just tucked it inside their outer clothing. That's how he was able to distinguish between the boys and the girls. Finally, the fourth challenge was to distinguish between fully dressed circumcised and uncircumcised boys. How does Solomon do that? He asked the Kohen Gadol to open the Aron, and then observed that the Shekhinah, God's presence, only settled on some of the boys who he concluded were the circumcised boys. How did he know this test would work? Well, because he knew from Bilam, who was uncircumcised, that Bilam, although he was faced directly by the angel of God, the Shekhinah did not actually settle on Bilam. So we note here, if the Queen of Sheba knew the answers to these questions, she must have had some knowledge of Judaism and biblical history. As we see, she knows about the daughters of Lot question and from what she knew about Bilam. Having validated all that she had heard about King Solomon and being duly impressed, she decided to convert to Judaism and popped the question to Solomon, who promptly added her to his collection of wives. The rabbis compare the Queen of Sheba with Yitro and with Rachav, the woman who saved Joshua's 2 spies. These were 2 important Gentiles who sought to cling to Israel. Rachav actually converted. Yitro sort of equivocated, went backwards and forwards, not sure what happened there, but certainly he's expressed great interest in becoming a ger. The Queen of Sheba bore Solomon a son called Ben Sira, who may have been the author of the apocryphal book of Ecclesiasticus, which is recognized by the church, but which is viewed as external in Judaism. I say may because, from what I've seen of an Ecclesiasticus, or the wisdom of Ben Sira as it's known, that was written considerably later. It was extensively researched after a significant number of fragments of it were found in the Cairo Geniza. A second very enigmatic and compelling Agadah about Shlomo HaMelech appears in the Gemara in Masechet Gittin. In its entirety, it is one of the longest passages of Agarata found in the Talmud, although it could actually be broken up into 3 separate sections. It relates to the interaction between King Solomon and Ashmada'i, known as Asmodeus in Greek, and involves communications with demons, which is all good material for folklore. A brief step-by-step summary is as follows. Step number 1. King Solomon is intent on building the temple, but as we know, he's not allowed to use iron implements because the temple signifies peace and iron is used for making weapons of war. He hears from various demons that Ashmada'i knows how to split stones without using metal tools. Step number 2. Benaiah, who's Solomon's messenger, is sent to fetch Ashmada'i, but he needs to use cunning and magical powers in order to persuade Ashmada'i to come. Step number 3. On their way together back to Solomon's palace, Ashmada'i performs a number of strange acts which perplex Benaiah. Step number 4. When they get to Jerusalem, to Shlomo HaMelech, in the palace, Ashmada'i asks King Solomon a number of riddles, which Solomon solves. Again, as with the Queen of Sheba, there are again tests to validate the extraordinary wisdom of Solomon. Now, in turn, Solomon asks Ashmada'i riddles, including how can he split the stones to build the temple without the use of metal implements. Ashmada'i revolves the secret of the shamir worm, which can cut anything that it looks at. Step number 5. Ashmada'i then overpowers Shlomo by stealing his royal ring and casts him off to a remote location and takes his place as the king. Shlomo somehow makes his way back to the Sanhedrin, where he eventually manages to convince them that he really is the king, at which point the Sanhedrin invokes the Shem HaMefurash, the divine name, which drives Ashmada'i away and allows Shlomo to reclaim his throne. Right, none of this has any mention whatsoever in the Tanakh. Right, this is all pure midrashic stories. Clearly, a very strange set of circumstances in which a demon is first friendly and helpful to Shlomo, then he becomes hostile, and eventually he's vanquished. Using the Greek name Asmodeus, this is another example of the connection between Jewish folklore and other cultures. In Christianity, Asmodeus is the demon of lust, who walks with a limp after fighting with another demon and falling from the sky. In Islamic culture, he is trapped inside a box of rock by King Solomon, cast into the sea, and eventually released by a fisherman. The common thread in all of these narratives is that each one requires only a tenuous connection with the biblical story. The expanded midrashic version does not rely on the actual text of the verses and can therefore stand alone under the presumption that the audience the intended audience in the Bet Knesset or the marketplace is at least somewhat familiar with the story, even if not familiar with the actual biblical text itself. Okay, before leaving the Midrashic era, let's just look briefly at another example of the literature around magic and demonology. In addition to what we just saw with King Solomon, demons feature quite often in Talmudic Agadah and in the Midrash. Now, you might think that demons, if they exist at all, will stay away from the Bet Midrash, preferring the open access of the secular marketplace or other public spaces. However, in the following Agadah from the Talmud, we see that is not always the case. The story is as follows. Rav Yaakov, the son of Rav Ahab ben Yaakov, was once sent by his father to study under Abaye, one of the famous Talmudic Amoraim. On his return, the father was disappointed. He saw that his son's learning was below his expectations. I am better than you, said the father to his son. You remain here, and I'm going to go to Abaye and see what I can learn from him. Abaye heard that he was coming. Now, there was a certain demon that haunted Abaye's Bet Midrash. So when any people entered the Bet Midrash, even by day, they ran the risk of being injured. So Abaye thought he'd solve the problem as follows. He ordered that let no man offer Rav Ahab ben Yaakov hospitality. Why did he do that? So he would have to sleep alone in the Bet Midrash. Perhaps a miracle will occur in the merits of his famous piety. So he, Rav Ahab ben Yaakov, entered and spent the night alone in the Bet Midrash, during which time a demon appeared to him in the guise of a seven-headed dragon. Every time the rabbi fell on his knees in prayer, one head fell off. The next day, he reproached Abaye. Had a miracle not occurred, you would have endangered my life. The scholars of comparative literature point out here the parallels with Christian dragon-slaying stories. In the Christian versions, a dragon takes over the public place and threatens the local inhabitants. Along comes a mythic hero or a saint. He cuts off the dragon's head or brandishes a cross in front of it and saves the day. In the Talmudic tale, Rav Ahab ben Yaakov comes to study and vanquishes the dragon by means of sincere prayer. He is not a warrior who volunteers to find a demon, but is manipulated into the position by Abaye, who knows of no other way to be rid of the creature. In the Christian version, the dragon is slayed in public, with many spectators. Why? So they can be duly impressed by the hero's actions and consequently convert to Christianity. The Jewish version takes place in the restrictive confines of the house of study, with no witnesses, in which the hero is a scholar, not a warrior. Okay, let's skip a few hundred years and move on briefly to review some literature from the Middle Ages. Now, historians define the Jewish Middle Ages as beginning with the Muslim conquests and expansion of the late 7th and 7th century, which is some 500 years prior to what's generally referred to as the Middle Ages. This demarcation stems from the clear division then existing between the Jews located in Christian Europe and those located in Muslim-dominated lands stretching from Yemen in the east to Spain in the west. This in turn has an impact on the development of folk culture, as Jewish culture was now able to be influenced by two distinct surrounding cultures. Overshadowing this expansion of Jewish folklore was another literary trend known as the separation of disciplines. What does that mean? Well, when you look back at the Talmudic literature in earlier times, it was holistic. Everything was in the Talmud. Everything was contained there. Biblical exegesis, medicine, halakha, astronomy, liturgy, and linguistics. But by the Gaonic period, the 8th and 9th centuries of the Common Era, we find specialization emerging. We now have separate books appearing on early codification of halakha, later to be refined by the Rambam, the Mishnah Torah. We find books on Hebrew grammar, biblical commentary, again, later to be refined and improved by Rashi, the Rashbam, Ibn Ezra, and so on. Books on Jewish philosophy, books or texts, let's call them texts, on Hebrew poetry, for example, Sajid Gaon, and texts on Jewish history. So we have a specialization. So this creation of distinct works on Jewish folklore would have been part of this specialization trend, although much of the new work is of unknown authorship. We also need to recognize the place of language in this era. Hebrew was not the spoken language, although it certainly remained the key written tongue, but by no means exclusively, because as we know, Sajid Gaon and later the Rambam both wrote in Arabic. Early forms of Yiddish and Judeo-Arabic would have been the vernacular, and folklore being conveyed orally from community to community over the years would often have been transmitted using the vernacular. The rabbinic folklore of this period is primarily an extension of the earlier midrashic versions of the same stories, but with an interesting new twist to conform to updated halachic and or accepted norms. And we can see this change from the following two examples. Okay, the first example is a story of Eliezer ben Dodia and his tzitzit, which appears twice in Talmudic literature. The first time it appears is in Masechet Menachot in the Gemara, tells of Eliezer ben Dodia hiring a prostitute. But when she sees his tzitzit, she ridicules him, declaring that on account of his sinning with her, he would not merit the world to come. He is so overtaken with her saving him from sin that he heads to an isolated place, feeling dejected. He sits down, weeps bitterly, and eventually he dies there. In the parallel early version, told in the Midrash Sifri Bamidbar, Eliezer ben Dodia, in the presence of this woman, on seeing his own tzitzit, and apparently he was much more fastidious about tzitzit than other mitzvot, he sees his own tzitzit, and he held back, which made such a positive impact on the woman that she repented from prostitution, liquidated all her property, and donated her money to charity. She then went to study in that same Bet Midrash of Eliezer ben Dodia. Eventually she converted and married him. So those are two very different early versions from the same period, Talmudic period, but two very different versions of the story. Now let's take a look at the medieval version, which was originally written in Arabic by Rabbeinu Nissim from Cairo in Tunisia. It's only based on the Sifri version that we just read with its sort of happy ending. Why is that? Why only on that version? Well, the one passed over from Masechet Menachot, where he dies, is an ascetic tale with a tragic moralistic message, and therefore does not lend itself so much to become a folk legend, which is easily transmitted orally across the generations. The version he selected to retell is an upbeat love story, which reverberates positively amongst the masses, and which, after all, is a necessary characteristic to guarantee longevity of folk legends. Additionally, one historic halachic point can be observed here. In the Sifri version, the woman arrives at the Bet Midrash with a note from Eliezer ben Dodia looking for him. The Rosh Yeshiva, Rav Chia, reads the note, immediately converts her, and marries the couple. But there's a thorn there, as we know that conversion purely for the sake of marriage is frowned upon. It would seem, however, that in Talmudic times, this constraint bore little weight, hence the immediate conversion. But in Rabbeinu Nissim's medieval version, the story is a little different. The way he tells it, the woman presents herself to Rav Chia in the yeshiva, but he attempts to drive her away, saying, "You must be after one of my illustrious students." At that point, she pulls out the note from Eliezer ben Dodia and shows it to Rav Chia. Rav Chia now sees that she has not just randomly arrived looking to pick up a man, but rather there is something substantial here going on. She tells him about all that transpired between them and how Eliezer ben Dodia set himself and her on a corrective path. Only when Rav Chia hears all of this does he permit her conversion and marriage. As we said before, now in the Gaonic age, halakha was no longer spread thin throughout the Talmud, but there are now specific books of piskei halakha, halachic decisions. which established firm criteria for determining behavior in different circumstances. Rabbeinu Nissim, in updating the story for his contemporary audience, changed the original conversion on request, which is now much more unacceptable, to a justifiable conversion based on exemplary behavior. Let's bring a second example of a change that occurred between the Midrashic version and the medieval version. This is the story of Bruria and her two sons. The Midrashic story appears in the Midrash on Proverbs. Bruria was a learned and compassionate wife of Rabbi Meir. While Rabbi Meir was out of the house teaching on a Shabbat afternoon, both of his sons died at home from the plague that was affecting their city. When Rabbi Meir returned home, he asked his wife, where are our sons? She handed him a cup for Havdalah, and he said the blessing. Again he asked, where are our sons? She brought food for him, and he ate. When he had finished eating, Bruria then said to her husband, my teacher, I have a question for you. A while ago, a man came and deposited something precious in my keeping. Now he has come back to claim what he left. Should I return it to him or not? Rabbi Meir responded, is not one who holds a deposit required to return it to its owner? So she took his hand and led him to where their two dead children lay. He began to weep, crying, my sons, my sons. She comforted him. The Lord gave, the Lord took. Yehei Shmei Rabban Vorach. May the name of the good Lord be blessed. That is the original Midrashic version from Mishlei Rabbah. The medieval folklore version is very different. Rabbi Meir is on the way to Shul on Shabbat, taking now his two sons with him. As they walk, a wall collapses and buries the two boys. Rabbi Meir does not perform any melacha on Shabbat to save them. Presumably, he gave up on them, otherwise there would have been a case of pikuach nefesh. So he continues to shul. When he returns home, he tells Bruria that he left the boys with friends. Later he goes out again, and when he returns without the boys, Bruria concludes that something bad had happened, but he accepts their fate. Later that evening, workmen are excavating the collapsed wall, and in the rubble, they find the two boys alive. They return home safely, where they explain to their delighted parents that they've been protected by a beam above their heads. So why is this later version, the medieval version, so totally reworked from the original? Firstly, in the original version, it is the mother who is the believer in the ultimate decisions made by God, and it's not ours to question his decisions. She displays righteousness and wisdom by concealing the tragedy until the father had rested. In the medieval version, the father is portrayed as the true believer. He thinks he's just lost his two sons, but he has to continue to shul to daven, as if nothing had happened. Why the switchover? It could be, and you may or may not agree with this, but it could be that it was unacceptable in the medieval period to portray the women as being religiously superior to the men. So if the man is now the hero, the whole story requires revision, from the boys dying at home in bed to being crushed by the wall. The second difference, the key difference, is of course the conclusion. In the Midrash, the boys die, but after a moment of grief, the parents accept the bitter decree. That stoicism plays well amongst the learned in the Bet Midrash to the masses, which is a prerequisite for successful folklore being handed down through the generations. Therefore, the revised medieval version demands a more popularly acceptable conclusion, with the boys being saved. In fact, the author ends off by saying that the very reason that the boys survived was their parents' piety. Let's move on briefly now, a few hundred years, to a whole different genre of Jewish folklore, that of Hasidic tales. We're now talking about the 18th and 19th centuries. Rav Nachman of Breslov is reputed to have stated, quote, "True, a story can put you to sleep, but it can also wake you up," end of quote. Since Hasidut started as a movement to empower the masses and uproot any inferiority complexes they might have had in comparison to the learned elite, it's not surprising that storytelling would become a primary component of their toolkit. Even in the days before mass media, stories would go viral in their own way. Two cardinal components of Chassidut are well suited to stories. One is the role of the tzaddik, who is a sort of intermediary between man and God. True, we have to be careful here because, as opposed to other religions, Judaism teaches that every person can approach God directly. Nevertheless, Chassidut does assign a key role to the tzaddik or the rebbe, and by revealing his ma'asim tovim, his good deeds, he takes on additional prominence and exhorts his followers to emulate him. The means to that dissemination is the story. The second component of Chassidut that benefits from storytelling is the concept of dveikut, or dveikus, of being attached firmly as possible to God. Dveikut is attained not only by prayer and meditation, but also by physical means, such as eating, drinking, including presumably vodka, dancing, singing, and yes, storytelling. One prominent scholar of the subject states, quote, "The tale, perhaps for the first time in the history of Jewish culture, acquired vital religious significance," end of quote. Another scholar who has compiled anthologies of Hasidic stories writes in his introduction, quote, "Behold, the masses of simple folk, when they read an awe-inspiring tale about a great tzaddik, will strain their ears to learn more of the works of God on earth," end of quote. In this era now, printing was readily available, so Hasidic folklores would start their journey as being orally transmitted, but because of the importance of these stories as a mass market product, they were soon printed for wider dissemination. This created two related professions: the itinerant Magidim who told the stories, and those who collected, edited, and printed editions to be more widely disseminated. I'm not going to bring any examples of Hasidic tales. I'm sure you all have heard many, and you know where in books and on the internet you can find them. But I do want to just conclude this section with the following quote from a folktale scholar. "No religious movement in the entire course of Jewish history has engaged so intensively in storytelling as Hasidism, nor have stories occupied such a central and important place in any other intellectual movement within Judaism," end of quote. That seems to me to be a fine sentiment with which to conclude the bulk of this presentation, but let me add two brief postscripts. First one is Tzena Urena. Most of you, I'm sure, have heard of Tzena Urena, first published in 1622 in Yiddish, followed by 210 subsequent editions, which demonstrates its endeared status. It incorporates much of the text of the weekly Parsha and the Haftarot and the 5 Megillot, expanded to include selected Midrashic stories, Agadata from the Talmud, and selected Rashi's comments. Later editions were also able to benefit from the now available Hasidic literature, so that too was appended. The original target audience was both men and women, despite the feminine language of the book's title, Tzena Urena, with the objective of providing Torah study tools in the vernacular for those, in the Ashkenazi vernacular at least, for those unable to master the original Hebrew and Aramaic. At some point, it became a primary Shabbat afternoon source for Ashkenazi women to informally learn the Parsha of the week with their families or in small groups. Interestingly, because the history of Tzena Urena spans some 400 years and multiple locations and multiple editions, there are scholars who have studied the various editions in order to characterize the linguistic development of Yiddish over time and locale. Modern Hebrew and English translations are available, but as far as I know, it is not often studied today, perhaps because of the multitude of English and other translated Torah literature available, but also because women today are much more educated and women have much more access to original texts. Think of Matan, for example, and other organizations that teach women. So I would have thought there's a less need today for groups such as Tzena Urena study groups. But maybe we can afterwards we can open it up to the floor. If anybody knows of, if anybody remembers their mothers or their grandmothers studying Zenoran, it would be interesting to hear. So that's one postscript. The second postscript in 2 lines is as follows. If you want to have some real good fun with one additional Jewish folklore source, look up Wisdom of Chelm on Google. Thank you for listening to this presentation.